What if the Zodiac Killer never truly disappeared? What if the taunting letters, the eerie symbols, and the cruel games with police didn't end in the 1970s, but instead continued under a different mask? Tonight, we explore a chilling theory that the so-called Zodiac Copycat might not have been a copycat at all, but the real killer, resurfacing to play his final cruel game. The summer of 1969 remains etched in America's collective memory, not only for the turbulence of the times, but for the sinister shadow that stalked California. Couples parked under starlit skies, friends driving late on lonely roads, and families opening their morning newspapers all felt the same creeping dread. The Zodiac Killer was out there. He called himself Zodiac. He wrote taunting letters to the press, filled with cryptic codes, strange symbols, and promises of further bloodshed. Unlike other killers who hid in shame, Zodiac seemed to thrive on spectacle. He wanted the world's attention, and he got it. Police forces across California scrambled, but despite fingerprints, composite sketches, and even surviving witnesses, Zodiac slipped away, untouchable, untamed, unknown. Years turned into decades. The letters stopped. The phone calls ended. The killings, at least officially, ceased. But the fear never really left. Then something strange began to happen. In the 1990s, letters strikingly similar to Zodiac's resurfaced. The handwriting carried the same mocking tone, the same obsession with puzzles, and the same delight in police frustration. Investigators debated. Was this the real Zodiac returning after years of silence? Or was it a cruel copycat, desperate for infamy by mimicking a legend? For the victims' families, the distinction hardly mattered. The old wounds ripped open once more. For the police, however, the question was everything. Because if the Zodiac had truly resurfaced, it meant a predator who had eluded justice for decades was still alive and still playing. Theories divided experts. Some dismissed the new letters as sloppy imitations, pointing out differences in style. Others swore the linguistic quirks, the cadence of the writing, even the subtle choice of words, felt far too genuine to be a mere forgery. And in the middle of it all, a darker possibility began to take shape. What if the copycat wasn't just a fan imitating a monster? What if the so-called copycat had been the Zodiac all along, adapting, evolving, and hiding in plain sight? The shadow of the Zodiac had returned. But this time, no one knew if they were chasing a ghost, an imposter, or the killer himself. The Zodiac Killer's letters may have stopped, but his shadow never left. Decades after his reign of terror, the Bay Area remained haunted, a place where every strange killing or cryptic message carried a single whispered suspicion. Was it him again? But in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, something curious began to happen. Letters started to appear, letters that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Zodiac style. They were taunting, cruel, and filled with the same kind of coded threats that once terrorized California. Yet, something about them fell off. Investigators noticed differences in handwriting. Forensic experts couldn't be sure the ink strokes matched the originals. Some dismissed these new notes as hoaxes, the work of attention seekers trying to piggyback off the legend of the Zodiac. But then, murders began to appear, murders that carried eerily similar signatures to the unsolved crimes of the late 1960s. In 1974, a disturbing letter was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle. It called itself the Exorcist Letter, mocking one of the most popular films of the decade. The letter seemed to echo the Zodiac's familiar voice, arrogant and condescending. Yet, linguistic experts debated whether it was truly him or someone else carefully copying his style. Then came the 1980s. A brutal murder in New York sent chills through seasoned detectives when a letter arrived to police claiming responsibility, signed with a symbol almost identical to the Zodiac's infamous crosshair. This time, the letter wasn't just words. It referenced details only the killer would know. Was the Zodiac still alive, resurfacing after years of silence? Or had a copycat studied his work so thoroughly that they were able to become him? The possibility that a copycat was responsible for murders outside of California sent investigators into a frenzy. Copycats usually seek attention, imitating without substance. But this was different. This was someone who not only imitated the style, they mirrored the crimes. And for families who had buried their loved ones years earlier, this wasn't just a game. It was reopening wounds. Every letter, every taunt, every cryptic code was a reminder that closure would never come. For police, the frustration deepened. If this was the real Zodiac, then he had evolved, adapting to stay one step ahead of investigators. If it was a copycat, then the question was even darker. Had the real Zodiac inspired someone else to keep killing? The nightmare wasn't ending. It was replicating. The Zodiac's ghost was multiplying. For decades, the Zodiac's letters had been the crown jewels of his reign of terror, taunting the police, mocking the press, and embedding ciphers that seemed designed to dangle answers just out of reach. The original letters, mailed between 1969 and 1974, had fascinated cryptographers, law enforcement, and amateur sleuths alike. Some were cracked, others weren't, but all carried the same chilling undertone. A man who wanted the world to know his name, yet never truly gave it away. Now, in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, letters began appearing again. Some were sloppy imitations, others strikingly similar. Local newspapers would open their morning deliveries and freeze an envelope, scrawled handwriting, the familiar phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The problem? Many of these letters were proven to be hoaxes, written by individuals seeking attention or hoping to stoke fear in a community haunted by unsolved terror. But then came a handful of letters that felt too close to the real thing. The handwriting matched more convincingly. The phrasing echoed the chilling arrogance of the original Zodiac. The codes, while simpler, were still constructed in ways that suggested someone deeply familiar with the Zodiac's original work. Even investigators who had grown cynical began to whisper, what if these weren't copycats? One letter, sent in 1990, rattled both police and experts. It contained references to cases and names not widely reported in the media. Details only the original Zodiac or someone close to the investigation could have known. Another letter, mailed in 2001, nearly 30 years after the Zodiac first wrote his infamous "This is the Zodiac speaking," was postmarked from Eureka, California. It shocked the San Francisco Chronicle staff who received it. Experts pored over it, debating endlessly. Was this an old man, the original killer resurfacing after decades of silence, or a brilliant mimic who had managed to learn details from the past? And then there were the confessions. Over the years, countless individuals stepped forward claiming to be the Zodiac. Some were mentally ill, others desperate for attention. Most were quickly dismissed. But every so often, a confession emerged that left investigators rattled. The handwriting matched closely enough. The person knew intimate case details. And yet, there was always some missing piece of evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no conclusive link. This blurred line between hoax and truth created chaos. Police departments, already stretched thin, debated which letters to investigate seriously. Families of the victims watched helplessly as the legacy of the Zodiac transformed into a circus of attention seekers and possibly, just possibly, the killer himself resurfacing. The chilling reality was this: the Zodiac case was no longer about a single killer. It had become a myth, a shadow that people stepped into and wore like a mask. And within that myth, the copycat may have found cover, an opportunity to kill, to write, and to taunt, without ever being truly noticed. The question no one wanted to ask aloud was this: if the copycat knew so much, and if some of these letters were real, then maybe the copycat wasn't just imitating. Maybe he was the Zodiac all along. The Zodiac killings left a trail of terror, but they also left something else behind: suspects. Some became household names, others were forgotten in dusty police files. And in the decades that followed, each time the copycat struck, through letters, coded messages, or cryptic threats, investigators were forced to ask the same chilling question. Were they looking at a new killer? Or was the real Zodiac still alive, hiding in plain sight? One of the earliest suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a man whose name became synonymous with the Zodiac in the public imagination. He was a convicted sex offender, a man with a violent temper, and someone who reportedly bragged to friends about wanting to kill people and send letters to the press about it. He wore a Zodiac brand wristwatch, the same name and symbol the killer used in his letters. He lived near the locations of several crimes, and yet nothing definitive ever tied him to the killings. His DNA didn't match. His fingerprints didn't match. Handwriting experts disagreed about whether he could have written the letters. For decades, police circled around Allen, convinced they were close, but never quite catching him. The copycat cases added another layer of doubt. If Allen was dead by the time these new letters and threats appeared, then who was writing them? Did it mean Allen had never been the Zodiac in the first place? Or that the Zodiac's identity was so much bigger than just one man, that it had become a story anyone could step into, like an actor taking over a role? Another suspect was Richard Gaikowski, a journalist and filmmaker whose appearance eerily resembled the Zodiac sketch. He was in the Bay Area during the murders, worked at a newspaper that fit with some of the killer's knowledge of journalism, and even had ties to codes and ciphers. Gaikowski's name surfaced again when the copycat letters appeared, because some claimed the writing style matched his. But once again, the evidence was circumstantial. There was also Lawrence Kane, a man with a history of stalking and mental illness, who had lived near one of the Zodiac's victims. He was said to resemble sketches, and even a surviving victim tentatively identified him as her attacker. But Kane, too, faded from suspicion as the years dragged on. Every new suspect brought a wave of hope. Maybe this was him. And yet every time, the evidence seemed to dissolve into smoke. For the copycat cases, the doubts grew even darker. Some experts argued that the copycat's letters were too clumsy, too obviously imitating the original Zodiac. They lacked the same clever wordplay, the same sinister confidence. Others disagreed, saying the changes in style were exactly what the Zodiac would do if he wanted to disguise himself. As one profiler put it, the copycat wasn't copying the Zodiac. He was evolving from him. And that's where the doubts took their sharpest turn. Because if the copycat was the same man as the original Zodiac, then the world wasn't dealing with an imitation at all. They were dealing with a killer who had survived into a new generation, reinventing himself in a way that kept him just beyond reach. The suspects list became a hall of mirrors. Everyone fit the role, and no one did. The copycat letters blurred the line further, keeping police trapped in the same cycle of obsession that had haunted them since the late 1960s. And through it all, the killer, or killers, remained silent, watching. Detective Laura Bennett sat in her dimly lit office, staring at two stacks of case files. On the left, the Zodiac case, yellowing papers, grainy crime scene photos, and letters that still mocked investigators half a century later. On the right, the copycat files, fresh ink, sharper photographs, modern victims whose families were still alive, still grieving. She leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself. It's like staring into the same mirror twice, but one reflection might be real and the other a mask. The problem wasn't just similarity, it was escalation. The original Zodiac had thrived on media chaos and cryptic games, but the copycat wasn't just repeating history. He or she was evolving it. One evening in 2015, Laura received a call that cracked open the case in ways no one expected. A college professor, an expert in cryptography, claimed he had uncovered a hidden message buried not in the old Zodiac letters, but in one of the copycat's more recent notes. "Detective, I'm telling you," he insisted over the phone, "this isn't just mimicry. Whoever wrote this letter knows things the original Zodiac wrote, but never published. Information that was withheld from the press." Laura's blood ran cold. That meant one of two things. One, the copycat had insider access to case files, which pointed to law enforcement leaks or retired officers. Two, the copycat wasn't a copycat at all. He was the original Zodiac, alive, older, but still taunting. For the first time, technology entered the fight. Digital forensics specialists ran the copycat letters through linguistic software, comparing syntax, sentence rhythms, and vocabulary choices to the original Zodiac's known writings. The results were chilling. A report landed on Laura's desk with one line highlighted. Probability of authorial match exceeds 78%. 78%. That was enough to raise eyebrows, enough to drag in FBI profilers, enough to rattle even the most skeptical investigators. Laura stared at the number, her hands trembling. Was this the break they had waited 50 years for? Or just another illusion? Another clever imposter weaving himself into the legend? As investigators reopened old witness statements, survivors were called back in for interviews. Some of them were elderly now, their voices frail, their memories blurred. But when shown the recent copycat letters, one survivor, a woman who had barely escaped Zodiac's attack at a lover's lane, began to weep. Her words cut through the silence of the interrogation room. It's him. It's the same voice in my head. I never forgot the way he taunted me. This isn't a copycat. It's the man who tried to kill me. That testimony shook the task force. To hear a survivor after decades of silence claim the copycat was the real Zodiac, it was like the ghost of the 1960s had walked straight into the present. But here lay the tragedy. Law enforcement wasn't unified. Some believed the survivor's recognition. Others dismissed it as trauma rewriting memory. The FBI pushed for digital profiling. Local police demanded more physical evidence. Retired detectives warned that chasing the Zodiac was like chasing smoke. Every time you thought you had him, he vanished. And while they argued, the letters kept coming, each one sharper, each one more mocking, each one demanding attention. Laura knew the truth in her gut. Whether copycat or original, this wasn't just about history anymore. It was about right now. And if they didn't stop him, someone else would die. The question haunted investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths alike. Had the Zodiac Killer returned? Or had the world been tricked all along by a meticulous imposter who had slipped through the cracks of history? The trail of evidence was a strange paradox. On one hand, handwriting experts leaned toward the Zodiac and the copycat being two distinct authors. The patterns of slant, pressure, and structure did not align perfectly. And yet, when the copycat's letters were compared to the later Zodiac communications, the overlap was so uncanny it seemed almost deliberate. Some investigators whispered a chilling possibility. What if the so-called copycat wasn't copying at all? What if he was the original killer, mocking investigators by making them doubt the very authenticity of his later work? The timeline only deepened the mystery. The original Zodiac was most active between 1968 and 1974. But then silence. A silence too perfect, too complete. For years, he vanished, until the sporadic reemergence of letters in the 1980s and 1990s, some dismissed as fakes. But what if the real Zodiac had intentionally stepped away, allowing his legend to grow cold before reigniting it with new terror decades later? The copycat letters from New York carried markers of age, of someone who had lived with these obsessions for decades. Certain phrases, odd turns of speech, words that felt outdated, hinted at a man much older than most imagined. Could this aging writer have been the same man who once stalked lovers' lanes in California, now hundreds of miles away, his hunger to taunt reignited? But then came the darker possibility, the one investigators struggled to admit. Perhaps the copycat was not only the real Zodiac, but had been hiding in plain sight. Maybe his killings had never stopped, only shifted, disguised under other names, buried in unsolved cases across America. The most haunting piece of evidence was one final, little-known letter sent in the mid-1990s. It was dismissed by the FBI as the work of a fraud. But in that letter, the writer claimed, "You think I'm a copycat? No, they copied me. Always have. Always will." The words were arrogant, chilling, and steeped in the Zodiac's trademark cruelty. Whoever wrote them wanted the world to question everything. And in truth, many did. By the end of the 1990s, the investigation had collapsed under the weight of time, bureaucracy, and fading memories. The copycat was never identified. The Zodiac himself was never caught. And the boundaries between the two blurred until even experts argued endlessly, unsure where one ended and the other began. Could the copycat really have been the Zodiac all along? We may never know. But perhaps that's the true cruelty of the story. A killer, whether one man or two, manipulated not just victims, but history itself. And tonight, as you reflect on the strange, twisting road of this case, ask yourself, if a killer can change faces, styles, even decades of silence, how would we ever know when the real monster is truly gone? Like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Chronicles, and tell us in the comments, do you think the copycat was the real Zodiac or just another shadow?